Great. Thank you, Brian. Hi, everyone. My name is Neelam Patel, Team Lead for Training Technical Assistants OVW, and I'm welcoming you to the final webinar for the fiscal year 2022-2021 TA orientation. Today we have Sandra Harrell and Cannon Hahn to present on accessibility and technical assistance and training. So I hope you enjoyed the webinar. A few reminders: if you have some recordings that you need to view, they're located on the TA website under the Technical Assistance and Training Orientation box. And for those of you who are new to TA as new staff or new organization and staff, you need to return the form that's on TA for the webinars that you have viewed to me, to the TA mailbox by February 14th. If you need additional time, just send me an email. And so with that, I will turn this over to our presenters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neelam, and thanks to NCJ FCJ for inviting us here today to talk about creating accessible training and technical assistance. I'm going to spend just a little bit of time with you today, just helping you to think through some basic considerations for accessible training and technical assistance, and to introduce you to some of the resources that the Vera Institute of Justice's Center on Victimization and Safety has available to you so that you are able to create more accessible training and technical assistance. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Sandra Harrell. I am a white woman with brown hair. I am wearing glasses and a black jumper, I think they say in England. It's just a sweater with a silver zipper, and behind me is my open door and a dark gray wall. I've been with Vera for 15 years and been working at the intersection of victimization and disability for 16 years, and overall in the violence against women movement for a really long time. I used to say it with pride, but then I realized how much it was aging me to share just how long I've been doing violence against women work. And for probably the first 15 years of my work within the violence against women movement, what I loved about the movement, what made the movement so important to me was, while I was seeing that there was this value of wanting to serve any survivor. And then what I criticized about the movement was that we fell short time and time again. We saw that with serving survivors of color, Black, Indigenous people of color were not getting the services that they needed. And we definitely saw this with older adults. But then about, as I mentioned, 16 years ago, I started working at this intersection and realized just how many barriers our programs within the violence against women movement have for survivors with disabilities and deaf survivors. And more than that, we as a team started, because we are TA providers and because we were sending people to other TA events, we were hearing a lot about how training and technical assistance that was being paid for by OVW wasn't accessible. And so we created really some concrete strategies to help folks better incorporate access considerations into the work that you're doing, because we know that that we have a value of wanting to include everyone, and sometimes we just don't have the tools to be able to do that well. So I'm going to introduce you to some basic considerations today, and then some opportunities for you to dive deeper. I do see that the few people, the few of the attendees who are here today actually just completed our online access training. So hopefully they'll share a thing or two about its usefulness. But let's get started with just understanding why this is so key for us as a movement, as TA providers. 1 in 5 people living in the United States has at least one disability. And that means that 1 in 5 of the people who should be showing up as staff to our organizations, as staff to the organizations that we're supporting through our technical assistance, has some form of a disability. Now, ableism has been effective and it has done its job. And so a lot of times people with disabilities aren't getting the opportunities to become part of the movement and the violence that they are experiencing. They are not getting the opportunities to work within our programs. I had a staff person who had been working for her local battered women's shelter for several years. I think it was 9 years. And they told her that she would never make it into leadership because she could not drive because of her disability. So while we should aspire to having 1 in 5 people at all of our events who have some type of disability, right now, because of the way that we have built our programs and our technical assistance, it's not likely that that's going to be the case. But we believe that if you build it, they will come. So we want to give this movement that we love so much the tools to be able to invite people with disabilities into the work that you're doing. Because people with disabilities do experience really high rates of victimization. They are, just checking whether or not I was jumping ahead here. They are at much higher rates, 3 times more likely to experience sexual victimization, so sexual violence. They have high rates of domestic violence. People with disabilities experience violence over and over again because they so often don't have any place to go. So we want people with disabilities to be part of our movement and part of the solution. In order to do that, we really have to create the space for people to be able to move comfortably and confidently throughout our trainings, our technical assistance, that they have an equitable experience to people without disabilities in your spaces, and that they're not made to feel like they are a burden for asking for what they need in order to participate. So I'm going to talk with you a little bit about some of the basic things that you can do to make that possible. And then again, I'll share with you some of the resources that we have. So when we think about accessibility, we think about the 4 different environments that people with disabilities and all of us are navigating at all times. So we have the attitudinal environment, and that's just sort of our beliefs, our expectations, our comfort level in working with people with disabilities, sort of our reflexive way that we move in this world. That's our attitudinal environment. And then there's a communication environment. This is just our written communication environment, as well as how we are sharing information orally. Our physical environments, which would be the built environment, certainly, but also just like the furniture in your physical space, any decor that you have in your physical space that might impede accessibility. And then, of course, we are living in a day and age where technology is a major part of our environment. And so we have to account for accessibility in all of these environments. So let's think about some ways that you can think about the attitudinal environment. How can you create more accessibility within this environment? First and foremost, flexibility is the key. If you are trying to shove square pegs into round holes, I never get those expressions right. I don't know why I keep trying to use them. It's never going to work. So I was just having a conversation with my center director this morning about survivors of human trafficking who have resorted to violence, and how what our sort of reflexive answer to anyone who has resorted to violence is to criminalize them. And yet it's very clear that someone who has been the victim of human trafficking is not going to like do well in the prison system. So why do we do that? I think that's the same thing when we try to make a deaf person access all of the information that we are providing through written English. It's just an inflexibility. Even if you're providing captioning, if English is not their first language, which for many people in the deaf community, American Sign Language is their first language, providing just captioning is not going to work. So making sure you're creating some flexibility in all of that. And of course, it takes some planning. You can't make things accessible at the last minute. You need to have a budget. You need to know information that you would collect from your registration. You need to know where you're going to be able to access this accommodation if somebody requests it. So you have to do some advanced planning. And of course, communicating with the person who has made the request, asking questions. If, for instance, somebody has requested CPrint and you have no idea what CPrint is, either asking that person, like, is there a local CPrint provider that you like and prefer? And can you give us the contact information? Or you can come to us and say, hey, someone asked for CPrint and we have no idea how to do that. That's what we're here for, to help connect you with the people and the consultants that we've already got on hand. So asking a lot of questions. And of course, being respectful and inclusive in what you're doing. So if you are advertising your event, signaling to people with disabilities that they are welcome and wanted by saying, these are the access considerations that we will have in place. If you need something in addition to this, please let us know. We really want you to be a part of this meeting. So those are some of the things you can do in your attitudinal environment. I'm going to pause to see if there are any questions. If I can clarify any of that. We'll have more time for questions at the end, but I want to make sure. Okay, great. So this moves us into our communication environment. Within the communication environment, we're really thinking about the way that we are sharing really important information with people, right? So if you're hosting an event, if you're hosting a webinar, or you're hosting a virtual event, or even an in-person event, and the days pre-COVID and the one day post-COVID, we'll all be back together. Presumably you're sharing important information at that event, and so you really want to think about ways that you can ensure that everybody who is there can fully access that information. So again, I mentioned that American Sign Language in the deaf community is often the first language and the primary language that most deaf people learn. And so if someone requests ASL interpreting, closed captioning and reading lips is not going to do the trick. So making sure that you are prepared to provide ASL interpretation. Any event longer than an hour would need a team of 2 interpreters. And those interpreters run from $65 an hour to $75 an hour. So again, you need to have it within your budget to be able to provide ASL interpretation. Closed captioning. There's a very large number of people in our society who have either single-sided deafness or late deafened, and therefore their first language is English, and they can better access oral information through closed captioning in English. So if you're providing ASL interpretation, that is not going to serve the needs of people who need closed captioning. Keep that in mind. And if you're providing closed captioning, that's not necessarily going to serve the needs of people who need ASL interpretation. If you attend our events, you'll see that we have both ASL interpreting and closed captioning, because we're wanting to create usability for the largest, broadest range of possible users at our events. And then, of course, there are going to be times where our events, we have a lot of people with intellectual or cognitive disabilities who attend our events. And so we really strive to make our information in the plainest possible language. We're actually going through a bit of rebranding within our center right now. And this is part of the conversation that we're having is like, will this tagline be accessible to people with intellectual disabilities? Are they going to know what this concept that we're trying to convey means here in the way that we're currently writing it? And so it's just basically you're using the most common words, you're avoiding jargon, you're avoiding idioms. Earlier, I tried to use an idiom, but those basically idioms are common expressions that are really tied to culture. And so if hearing culture has an idiom, that's not going to resonate within deaf culture. So really trying to avoid those sorts of idioms. And then there's a different kind of language that you can write in, which is augmented language. This has also been referred to as simple language, but then our society made the idea of simplicity somehow bad, and so it started to get a bad rap. And so then they moved a lot more to like easy read language or augmented language. It is essentially you're using far fewer words and far more images to augment what you're trying, the concept that you're trying to convey there. I think this comes to play in TA, where if you're working with a direct service provider, augmented language can be incredibly helpful for not just people with intellectual disabilities, people in crisis who can't take in a whole lot of words at one time, but could maybe with like a word coupled with an image, they can better understand that. So that is primarily how this might show up, is in your own technical assistance to your providers. But something that if somebody were to request simple language, easy read language, or augmented language for one of your events, that's not the same thing as plain language. And so we have had TA providers who got a request for plain language, did their level best to put it in plainer language, and still it wasn't what the person needed to participate. So then we get into your physical environment, and here we're talking about your the location that you choose, like your venue. It is the way that you've set up your meeting room. It is the way that you have set up, if you have it in a different fund other than federal fund, food and beverage. But basically, all of those elements really impact a person's ability to move comfortably and confidently through your meeting space. Meeting room setup is critical. You want to create, I think, historically, even at music venues, right? You'll see one row of accessible seating. I think they still call it handicap seating. But you'll see like maybe a row of two of accessible seating, and it's good seating, but it's one or two rows. That's the only place for someone with a disability to be able to sit there. At our meetings, that has often happened as well. You have like one or two tables set up for deaf people, so that they have line of sight for the interpreters, or you might have, a couple of tables in the back of the room set up for people with disabilities. But what we want to create is training and technical assistance events where a person with a disability and a deaf person would have just as much choice about where they're going to sit as anyone else in that space. Just as much choice about whether they want to sit with a colleague or somebody that they just met last night as anyone else in that space. And so we have guidelines for meeting room setup that create that, which include that you'd have 36 inches between all barriers. So that would include your tables, your AV equipment, any drink stations or water stations that you have set up. You have 36 inches throughout. And then there's lots of other little things to think about there. You also want to create line of sight for interpreters. And this might mean that if you only have 2 front of the room interpreters and you have a really large event, that you rethink that, because the only way to make that work is if there's only one place for the deaf folks to sit, and that would be right there at the front of the room. So you may have to rethink how to create that line of sight, and that may be that you hire more interpreters to copy sign throughout the room, or you assign interpreters based on the number of attendees. So if you have 6 attendees and 6 deaf attendees who have requested interpreters, you might hire 12 interpreters and just pair those 6 deaf attendees with their own interpreters throughout your event. Then food and beverage, I love to talk about food and beverage because I love food and beverage, first of all. And I particularly like food and beverage that we get at events. It's like, I don't know why, but maybe it's because when I was like a poor advocate working at a battered women's shelter in Louisiana, go into a conference, I was like, wow, this food is delicious. But anywho, I went out on a tangent there. I'd like to dream about the days that we're providing food and beverage. When we get to those days at some point, we want to make sure that we're setting up all of those items flush to the edge of the table. And what this means is, so this is the table. You'd want to have all of your trays on the edge of the tables right through here. You don't want them in the center, which is usually where banquet staff will place them, and they'll put them on these big, beautiful risers, and they really prioritize the aesthetics of that. The placement of those trays and cups and all of that over accessibility. And it just means that you're creating a situation where someone with a disability is going to need to ask for help and someone without a disability won't. It's also, in the age of COVID, I can't imagine that we'll be doing anything that's going to have us reaching over stuff like that anymore. So I think it's just more hygienic as well. And then you want to, if you have coffee cups, you want to make sure that those cups are not stacking more than 2 cups high. So just 2, not 6. And then you want to account for personal care attendants. Many people with disabilities, when they do travel with the personal care attendant, and that personal care attendant may be with them at every part of the meeting. So the way that impacts your physical space is that's one more person taking up space in there. So it's just something to think about. And then you want to make sure that your accessible restrooms are on the same floor as your meeting space, and that they're actually accessible. There's some key considerations in our access training around all of that. And then I'm just a big fan of signage and wayfinding, because I do not have an internal compass when it comes to finding my way around in this world. And so when I see signs that say, hey, you're at the right place, it gives me a sense of relief. And we have heard this from many, many people with disabilities, that they have a similar sort of experience of like, okay, I'm already worried about what I'm going to find at this space. But being sure that I'm actually there and getting to the right place without having to ask for help over and over is really key to navigating that physical space. And then technology. So we are doing more and more and more of our events electronically, right? Like virtually. I know we took an in-person access training and turned it completely into an online course. We're doing, for the grantees that we support, we do monthly meetings of the grantees. When we used to do like twice a year in-person meetings, now we're doing monthly virtual meetings to keep that connection going, to help foster a network among them, all of that. All of that requires a lot of attention to accessibility. It comes down to the platform that you choose. You see that we're using Zoom Webinar right now. I know that NCJ, FCJ also has Adobe Connect. Adobe Connect is probably the Cadillac of accessibility. If you are wanting to check all the 508 compliance boxes with ease, Adobe Connect is the one to do it. However, it's harder to use for a lot of people, and it is not the best for the deaf community. And so this is sort of what comes into play for lots of folks. Like you have to figure out what's actually going to be the best for your audience. And we moved to Zoom Webinar because it was much easier for our participants with intellectual and cognitive disabilities to navigate Zoom Webinar, and our deaf participants have a much better experience with Zoom than with Adobe Connect. So that's some of the things you have to consider. It comes down to the platform. If you're hosting on an inaccessible platform, it's like you chose an inaccessible in-person venue, right? People with disabilities are not going to be able to have an equitable experience. But then you also have to think about your PowerPoint, your Word docs, the videos that you're using. And then if you're in person, the use of AV, such as microphones, and other sorts of AV that might come into play in person, might be draping if you have a lot of deaf participants and a lot of material being shared in a space where behind the person, that it's like really busy background. You might want to drape the background so that there's not as much eye strain. And then, of course, the use of images or tables. So just quickly with PowerPoint and Microsoft Word, they have accessibility checkers built in to PowerPoint and Word docs. And when it comes to creating sort of accessible versions of PowerPoint and Word docs, we're really looking at sort of the underbelly, the structure that you use. And we have a much more in-depth training about this, but it's basically, you've got to use what they provided you. Otherwise it's not going to be accessible. That's sort of the short of it. You want to use the PowerPoint templates. You want to make sure that if you have to create your own template, that you're using the styles that they put in place for you. And then there is a quick accessibility checker in PowerPoint that you can figure out what's going on with your PowerPoint. And if you don't know how to fix it, that's where we come in. You can come to us and say, hey, I'm getting 100 errors here. Can you walk me through how to fix this? If you are really pressed for time, and you don't have the time to have us walk you through fixing it, we can fix it really quickly for you. We're here for you to do that for you. So don't hesitate to ask. And then for videos, you want to make sure that you have closed captioning in your videos. If you are also going to have deaf folks in the audience, you're going to want to share the video with your interpreter in advance so that they know the content and they can either interpret the video or they may not. It really comes down to what the deaf participants prefer. We've heard mixed things, and we always defer to what our participants want. We showed a documentary one time, and we asked, and they said, we'd actually just rather read the captions than try to pay attention to what's going on the screen, the interpreter. It just gets too confusing. So always defer there to your deaf participants. If you build out your PowerPoint and Word docs accessibly and export into a PDF, PDF will retain the accessibility. But if you've built them out inaccessibly to begin with, PDF is going to retain the lack of accessibility, and it's much, much harder to change the accessibility in a PDF than it is to just go ahead and build them out in Word or PowerPoint and then convert to PDF. And then with images and tables, it's just really important that you're including alt text throughout your images and tables because the screen readers are going to be capturing that sort of information. And if you're including an image and it's germane to the presentation, then it needs to have alt text attached to it. And that is me in 30 minutes. I did want to quickly tell you that our End Abuse of People with Disabilities website, endabusepwd.org, has all of our online courses as well as tip sheets and all of the recordings and live events. So we encourage you to go there and sign up. Yes, Brianne?
I just wanted to pop on and we have some comments and questions in the chat. So I just wanted to help you. Because I know it's hard to screen share and look at the chat. So we have somebody who asked, is it acceptable to ask registrants for what special accommodations they need, or should we assume that those services be automatically provided at all trainings and meetings that we host?
This is Sandra. It's perfectly acceptable to ask registrants what accommodations. We try to stay away from saying special accommodations because it's just an accommodation. Like we all as people without disabilities, we're getting accommodations all the time. Like if all of us were blind, we wouldn't have lights. If all of us used wheelchairs, we probably wouldn't have as many shoe stores. So like it's just something that they need. But yeah, it's perfectly acceptable to ask through registration. And we happen to have a registration tip sheet, Margaret, that gives you some of the questions that you can ask that will not only help you to be prepared to meet those accommodations, but will also signal to your potential participants that you're thinking about accessibility, that you're welcoming them. Let's see. We got a comment from Kelly that you should really always consider providing food with unrestricted funds when you are able, especially with communities most impacted by systemic oppression, such as people with disabilities. Thank you for that, Kelly. Yes, good stuff from the Idaho Coalition. If you're asking people to come to an in-person event and you're going to be hiring interpreters for that event, you may want to ask them if they have a preferred interpreter and fly in their preferred interpreter. For virtual events, that may or may not apply, but I think we have so many deaf people attend our events that there's no way we could hire all of their preferred interpreters for that because we have just a lot of deaf participants at our virtual events. And it could get really confusing to have too many interpreters on the screen. But yes, that's a great point, Margaret. And then Victor is asking, should the availability of accessibility resources at a function be contained in the material sent? Should we be also considerate when even preparing the material advertising an event? Yes, Victor, that's exactly the sort of things so in our information, through registration, through our save the dates, through all of that, our confirmation, we're talking about accessibility every step of the way. And then in our program, we have a checklist, tips for maintaining the accessibility of the space. And then, yes, even as you're advertising it, you should think about the accessibility of how you're advertising. So in our online course of the Access training, there's one dedicated to accessible materials, creating welcoming and accessible materials. And that helps you think through your font choice, your color contrast, your even the paper that you're using to advertise on, all sorts of different elements of accessibility come into play there. And you're absolutely right. Everything from when you start advertising it to even when you're following up and collecting evaluations, you should be thinking about accessibility every step of the way. And then the final one is securing interpreters and last minute registrations can sometimes be difficult. Any strategies to navigate this? Yes. Not only is it really difficult to secure interpreters at the last minute, it's really hard to secure qualified interpreters at the last minute. So just having a body in the room doing the interpreting is not going to provide someone with the best possible experience, or even with a mediocre experience, quite frankly, because what we find is the qualified interpreters are getting scheduled way out, right? And so you need to, our recommendation is to either plan to have interpreters at your event, and then when you close registration, if you're the type of organization that closes registration 20 minutes before your event, just plan to have interpreters at your event, because then you have good qualified interpreters, and your event's going to be accessible no matter how many last minute registrations come in. If you are able to close your registration early, we recommend that you try to close at least a week out from your event, because that gives you time, if you have held interpreters already, to go ahead and cancel them if no request came in without being charged. But basically, our strategy is as soon as we have an event on the calendar, we secure interpreters for that event. We ask them to hold their time, and then we watch our registration. And if we don't get any registrations for requests for interpreters, which has, by the way, never happened for us, but if we were to get no request for interpreters, we would release our interpreters 1 week out, and that we've built that into our timeline. That's it. Thanks so much, everyone. I'm going to turn it over to my friend Cannon and just get off the screen here. Have fun, Cannon.
So I love going after Sandra, because all I have to really say is do everything that Sandra tells you to do and just add language access. So hi, everyone. My name's Cannon, and I work with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and we are funded by OVW to provide technical assistance and support to anything related to language access. So it's our job to help all of you around language access. And when we're talking about language access, we're talking both about spoken language and sign language. And just a reminder, it's not just American Sign Language, it's Mexican Sign Language, Japanese Sign Language, Spanish Sign Language, home signing. So when we're thinking about language access, thinking about the totality of all the languages that exist, and really educating ourselves about what the needs are for the people that we're working with. And another thing I want to add about the question about last minute interpreters, I think that it's really helpful if you develop relationships with the interpreters that you work with, right? So I've been bailed out multiple times because I've worked with sign language interpreters frequently, and I have a good relationship with them. So if I have a last minute request, I can reach out to them, and they're so great about helping, supporting me and trying to connect me with other qualified interpreters. So COVID has really changed the way that we do the work that we do and the technical assistance and training that we provide, and made us really rethink how we are doing things. And normally, as national technical assistance and training providers, we're used to being doing national conferences, going to these national conferences, state conferences, and doing presentations where a lot of times the people that we work with or the direct service providers or the people that we're encountering frequently are English speakers, right? And really, in order to apply for OVW funding, the people that are applying have to be able to speak English. And so we've kind of fallen into this space, or at least I have fallen into the space where I'm used to just presenting in English and not really thinking beyond that. And what COVID has done is it's opened access to our technical assistance and training to a lot more people. And a lot of those people who normally wouldn't be accessing our training because their position doesn't allow them to go to these national trainings or to these state trainings. Now, because it's web-based, they're asking for access. They're interested in the training that we're providing. They're interested in reaching out and getting technical assistance from us. And so, Brianne, if you ever want to jump in, the last 2 years, Brianne and I have been trying to figure out, what's the best way to make our technical assistance and training language accessible. So the first thing is notifying your grantees about the availability of interpreters and translated materials. So taking a look at your training registration, right? Are your registration forms translated? Have you been able to identify the languages that your TA recipients speak and the service populations that they serve, right? So, what we've been trying to do on our culture-specific service program side is to do outreach to organizations and identify languages that they speak and languages that their clients speak, the resources that they need, most frequently encountered languages. So we encourage you to reach out to your grantees and say, hey, what languages are you providing services? What languages does your staff speak? What are the greatest needs of resources in the languages that you've done, that you're encountering, right? So really kind of doing homework on our part so we have a better understanding of what the need is. Taking a look at our website and considering, should we be translating certain materials? And I'm going to talk a little bit about it later about mechanized translation, but that little Google Translate, it's okay, but depending on the information you're trying to share, it can have a huge impact on the messaging that you have and the accuracy of that messaging. Then also taking a look at trainings and phone calls, video calls, and how you're providing accessible content. In addition to asking the grantee, looking at census information. Don't just rely on the census, because the census is really, it's a starting point, but it's not the best data, right? It identifies Chinese as a language, right? So what does that mean? Mandarin, Cantonese, we have no idea. It doesn't identify indigenous languages. We are frequently encountering a lot more need and assistance for indigenous languages. So that's not going to be tracked. We are getting a lot of the communities we work with, a lot of the service providers and grantees we work with, they are going to be working with and addressing the needs of refugees from Afghanistan. So census data is not going to be tracking Pashto and Dari speakers, right? And where they are at. So, Department of Education, whether it's state or local, is a great resource. Another great resource is your Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, your EEOC office will have some data if you can reach out to them and talk to them. Hospitals, courts, other direct service providers. So we definitely encourage you to reach out to the different resources so that you have the best data possible. So when we're talking about providing language access, if you have the internal capacity to provide that through staff, that's awesome. If you have your staff providing technical assistance and training in language, what we encourage you to do is, those staff, they're an incredible resource, so we encourage you to pay them appropriately for their language skills. So budget for that. In addition to that, when you're submitting your budget, creating your budget for your grants, have a line item for interpreters and translators, right? I don't think that in any instance you are going to get penalized for having a line item for interpreters and translators, or actually budgeting for a pay differential for language skilled staff. The importance of developing relationships with interpreters and translators, they frequently are your best resource for finding other interpreters and translators, particularly in languages of lesser diffusion. Request interpreters and translators with subject matter experience and training. So really quick with American Sign Language, I would encourage you to look at Registry for Interpreters for the Deaf. That's where the certifying body for ASL interpreters. If you are looking for a sign language other than American Sign Language, it can be very difficult to identify those interpreters. If you need assistance with that, please feel free to reach out to us and we can reach out to our connections. When we're talking about spoken language, very frequently, because we are dealing with the legal system, a lot of systems rely on court interpreters. Certified court interpreters are really hard to come by in terms of doing presentations for conferences, doing trainings and things like that. So you are going to be looking for generally conference interpreters or interpreters that do administrative hearings, school administration hearings, different types of interpreters. So you frequently won't be working with court interpreters. And then also the tricky part is with languages of lesser diffusion, there may not be any kind of certification or license. So a lot of it depends on word of mouth and on in terms of interpreters that you'll be contracting with. Confidentiality is another thing that we want to highlight, particularly if you're doing technical assistance and it involves privileged or confidential information. Make sure that the interpreter clearly understands their obligation. A lot of times what we encourage you to do is when contracting with interpreters and translators, whether they're individuals or with companies, to include a code of conduct, right, that highlights confidentiality as one of the things that they agree to follow. And if you're interested in some sample contract language, when you contract with interpreters and translators, we have a couple copies of those. For trainings, give yourself at least 3 to 4 weeks before the training to find an interpreter and translator. This goes back to what Sandra was talking about, just, with American Sign Language, just having an interpreter translator in place is going to be helpful. In our case, it's a little more difficult because over 200 languages and dialects are spoken in the United States, and so the requests that come in, you want to do the best that you can to accommodate for that. But the challenge really is finding those qualified interpreters. In some languages, it's going to be easier, but it also depends on the locality, right? We normally think finding qualified Spanish interpreters should be easy for us, right? My colleague and I, we did a training in a rural part of California, and we contracted with the most highly recommended interpreters. And while we were there, and my Spanish is really poor, really, really poor. But one of the interpreters was so bad that even I realized that the Spanish wasn't going well, right? And so one of the things to consider is if you are going to an area where there aren't as many interpreters, or there's questions as to the actual skill of the interpreters, you may have to travel in your own interpreters. With remote and virtual trainings, having it increase access, we still need time, right? And so when we're doing trainings, and I think, we talked a little bit, Sandra talked a little bit about registration and kind of keeping registration open to the last minute. It makes it harder when you have registration open for so long, because on the last day of registration, which is 2 days before your training or conference, if you start getting requests for languages, you get requests for Karen or Mixteco. It's very difficult to find and identify interpreters and to cycle that around quickly enough to accommodate for those language requests. So one of the things to consider is closing your registration 3 to 4 weeks before the event so you can make sure that you can accommodate all the language requests that you're getting in it, and you can accommodate them and you have enough time. And another issue, not just interpretation, is if you are doing a training, you have materials, you have written materials, and it's also important to translate those materials. So if you get a last minute request for Karen or a last minute request for Armenian, right? Will you have time to have all those materials? You found an interpreter, you won't have enough time to have all those materials translated into Armenian to accommodate the language needs. So a lot of what we're thinking and talking about now is kind of a shifting of how we approach the way that we provide training. Another question that's come up is multilingual chat. And so we've transitioned to Zoom. I mean, I've worked with Adobe Connect, Teams, Google, video, Zoom. And one of the features that we like to take advantage of is, and to help facilitate communication and keep our attendees, our trainees engaged, is chat, right? So if chat is a feature, if the Q&A in Zoom is a feature, is that going to be accessible to people who are limited English proficient? Will you be able to facilitate a conversation around a multilingual presentation, right? So you've got attendees who are Spanish speaking, Korean speaking, Russian speaking. Will they be able to engage in the chat? And if you are offering chat in those languages, do you have the capacity to review the chat, have it interpreted for the presenter, and be able to respond in the chat? So these are a lot of things that, in terms of what we think about as trainers, is how do we make our presentations more engaging, right? And so the chat is one of the tools that we have, and is it language accessible? A tricky thing about chat and then also captioning is that a lot of the technology doesn't accommodate for languages that are not based on Romance languages, right? So it's got to be, if it's Chinese characters, the chat feature may not work, and in turn your captioning feature service may actually not work either. So it's a lot of technology and little things that you have to think about. So when working with interpreters, right, whether it's for your for trainings, it's going to take more time, right? So add 3 to 4 more weeks for your timetable. Add more time to your trainings if you've got an interpreter. Confirm that the interpreters that you're working with have subject matter knowledge, terminology needed to interpret for you. Provide copies of your training materials in advance to the interpreters. Provide copies of TA materials to the interpreter. So if you're going to be providing technical assistance, that you're going to refer to a resource guide or a toolkit, make sure your interpreter has a copy of that. And then for anything that's going to be interpreted that exceeds an hour, hiring 2 interpreters. So going back to having more time and providing your materials in advance. If you are having a conference or you've got a workshop and you're having a consultant or subject matter expert come in, they may be guilty like me, where I provide the materials kind of a day or 2 in advance, right? So that's not helpful for the interpreter. So you're going to want to provide and establish deadlines for the submission of materials, so your interpreter has an appropriate amount of time to review the materials so that they're ready. The more complicated the content is, the more time your interpreter will need in order to review the materials. So, giving them, 3 or 4 days with the materials to review it and prepare for interpretation is really important. If needed, set up separate call-in lines for language interpretation. I'm guilty of this. I talk too fast, so definitely talk slower. Provide pauses for the interpreter so that they can maintain pace. Provide breaks if you're only working with one interpreter. on providing technical assistance training to a deaf advocate, contract with a certified deaf interpreter in addition to an ASL interpreter. And so this has been explained to me, and so much appreciation for the VERA Institute and all of the expertise and assistance that they provide to us is so for an ASL interpreter, American Sign Language generally isn't their first language, right? So it's a second language, and very frequent. And what's been explained to me, and Sandra, please jump in if I'm off base or if you want to add to it, is that in order to actually have the most effective communication and understanding, that with a deaf advocate is to have a deaf interpreter communicate to them, right? Because sign language would both be their first languages, right? And then you would have as a relay a hearing ASL interpreter then interpret what the certified interpreter is signing, right? So if you want to provide for and allow for the most effective communication, particularly when we're talking to, and as TA providers, one of the things that we hope you all do is share the knowledge that you have, or that you have, the knowledge that you received and the knowledge you have around serving both limited English proficient but deaf survivors, is to share the need and knowledge around how to most effectively communicate to individuals who are either limited English proficient or deaf. I don't know, Sandra, did you want to add anything to this?
This is Sandra. No, I completely agree, Cannon. I will say that that certified deaf interpreters, the community of certified deaf interpreters is relatively small compared to American Sign Language interpreters. So this is absolutely, for instance, if you have in-person conference and you're going to have copy signers, you would have certified deaf interpreters at the front of the stage, and it would be the ASL interpreters who would be doing the copy signing behind them. But they're hard to find. There's not a lot of certified deaf interpreters in the country, so this is definitely a great practice, and I thank you so much, Cannon, for bringing it up, because I think it's something that we want to promote more and more, especially when you're working with survivors who are in crisis and who are deaf. I think we're several years away from having enough certified deaf interpreters to make it standard practice.
And also to add to Sandra's point, there is a distinction, and Sandra mentioned it before, between spoken language and sign language. And with the deaf and sign language interpreters, very frequently a deaf survivor may request or may desire to have their preferred interpreter interpret for them, right? In spoken language, the standard and the practice is interpreters who don't know the survivor, right, to avoid any bias or conflict of interest. But because of the nuances of sign language and the regionalities that exist with sign language, and also the advocate's comfort or the survivor's comfort with the sign language interpreter, if they choose to have somebody, if they express to you the desire to work with a preferred interpreter, that's the way you have to go. In my opinion, you have to go that way. Another thing is the deaf community is very small, and interpreters and the people that are working as interpreters, it's also cool. And interpreters that you may select or may hire may know that the deaf survivor in another capacity, right? And they may not be comfortable having that interpreter interpret for them because of that. So just want to highlight that distinction. Whether or not you use it in your practice as TA providers, definitely knowledge that we want you to have to share with the grantees that you work with. For video and telephonic interpreters, take down the interpreter identification number so you can request specific interpreters. And so once again, if you find a good interpreter, identify that interpreter and request that interpreter in the future. If using Zoom, Adobe Connect or other online training communication platforms, do a tech check ahead of time. So and when I talk about tech check, make sure that you're not the person responsible for the tech check, that you have support on the back end. A lot of times we try to do everything ourselves and it doesn't work out so well. And so I didn't complete this sentence, but set up a separate line of communication with your interpreters. I actually learned this from some ASL interpreters I work with, where they share their phone numbers so that they can chat with each other, so that they can address any issues and or confirm any language things that come up. And so what I encourage you to do is set up a separate communication line so that you can communicate directly with the interpreters and they can communicate with you and identify and address any issues that might come up. So once again, for trainings, dedicate one staff person to manage the interpreters. Check in with the interpreters after your training or technical assistance session to identify any potential issues. Another thing that we encourage you to do is in your assessments after trainings, or if you have a technical assistance assessment, include questions about the interpretation. So very frequently, obviously, since we don't speak the language, it's really hard for us to identify if anything is going wrong, right? So we want to check in with the people that we're working with, provide technical assistance training, and ask to see if if the interpretation was good, if the interpretation was bad, if the setup wasn't correct. So yeah, we want you to make sure that you include those in your assessments. So translation. So in looking at the technical assistance and training that we provide, what are the resources that are going to be needed? What are the resources that are going to be used? What do we want? What do we want our grantees to be using? And then consider translating those materials, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to translate everything, but what we want you to do is take into consideration what types of resources you have and what you feel like should be translated. So rather than waiting for a request to come in, start reviewing your materials to start identifying the languages that you might want to translate some of your materials into. So website, online resources, training videos, video content. So I like using videos, and it's a great training resource. It helps to keep people engaged. We encourage you to look at captioning, right? And so both in terms of disability access, so captioning in English, but also captioning or subtitling in languages other than English, particularly if you know that your audience, the grantees that you're working with speak and read a language other than English.
We've learned in Zoom, this platform specifically, you have to pay for if you want a live captioner during the session. And then if you want it post-captioned, you either need to have a program that can do that, or if you send it out, you have to pay for that as well. Zoom doesn't capture captioning within a recording. So if that's something you're trying to do, that's something to think about. If it's an on-demand training, I would suggest you do the session and then send it out so you're not paying for it twice. There are different costs to all of these things, and different costs for different platforms, different costs for different languages. So if you do want more information about my experience and also working with Cannon and Sandra, they are wonderful experts and resources, and I reach out to them all of the time. So I'm happy to follow up with people too.
Brianne, really quick, I remember one of the things where I forget if it was captioned or recorded, and then to pay to have it translated into another language. I remember it was like tens of thousands of dollars, but I don't remember what it was. Do you remember that?
So that is something also, we also learned, if like today we're captioning or this is presented in English, if we don't have a language line and we need it captioned into a different language, it will cost you more in a recording because they need to translate it first and then caption it. If you are providing a language line, I suggest you record that language line and have send the language audio along with your recording, and that will save some money that way. Paying for the live interpreter is less expensive than trying to pay for it to be translated after the fact. But yes, translating materials is something that I have discovered is quite a budget cost. I can say for the orientations, for the new grantee orientations, we had 6 office-wide sessions, and we are trying to get the PowerPoints translated for those 6 sessions into 2 different languages, and it is about $30,000 to $40,000 to do that. So it is definitely time sensitive, so you do need to timeline it out, especially if you're doing multiple languages, and there are budget implications for that. And it does depend on the language and the time you need it. If you need something in a certain time frame, that's going to cost you more. If it's short, like I would say less than a month. So all things to consider, and I will say all things that I'm learning about as well as we go through our process of providing training in TA.
Thank you.
Is that what you were referring to?
That was. Thank
Okay.
you so much, Brianne. And Brianne has so much direct experience in this stuff, and so she's a great resource. And so thinking about presentations, resources, notifications, contracts, registrations, notification for rights to interpreters and translations, right? So, my tendency is to strongly encourage, if you're notifying of rights to an interpreter, it can be in English. It's great if you can translate that into the target languages. And so Brianne talked about this, right? Budget. So really thinking about how much you set aside for translation, and if you haven't set aside enough for translation, working with your grant specialists to see if you can move some money around to accommodate the need for translators. The reality is we are in a position, in terms of both budget and time and resources, where we are going to say we won't be able to accommodate all language requests and needs, but we want to position ourselves so that we can put in our best effort, right? And I think that, when Brianne threw out that number, 30 to 40,000, I'm sure a lot of you are like, wow, I don't know where that kind of money would come from, right? So it is, looking at different strategies for providing accessibility. If you have language skilled staff, that's why, if you have language skilled staff that can work on and they know how to translate, because once again, speaking and reading a language isn't an equivalency to actually being able to translate. But if you have language skilled staff, making sure that you pay them, because that is a skill set that is very expensive when we go out to the open market to hire interpreters and translators. Making sure that you pay them appropriately and you recognize that language skill and the skill set to translate. 3 to 4 weeks to find qualified translators, particularly in languages of lesser diffusion. You can contract out to companies. There are companies that provide translators. But, if it's a language of lesser diffusion, if it's harder to find, you're going to have to reach out to the networks and find translators. Definitely reach out to us. We're happy to assist you. Brianne and SCJ have been working with a lot of translators, and I'm sure they can share their list of translators that they've worked with. But once you found the translators, depending on the content, both in terms of the level of expertise needed to translate it and how much material you have, it could take a month to get everything translated, right? And so that shifts kind of your timeline in what you're able to do in terms of registration, right? Because if you are getting language requests in and you want those translated materials available on the day of the training, you're going to need anywhere from 1 to 2 months to get those materials translated. So American Translators Association is a national certifying agency for translators. So the distinction between interpreters and translators Translators are written language, so written form to written form. Interpreters are spoken language or sign language. So obviously you want somebody that has subject matter expertise. Confirm back translation. So that is a standard practice. If you translate with professional interpreters or professional translators or translator companies, they should have back translation built in as a quality check. So what that involves is the translation is done, so from English to Spanish, right? And then a translator not involved in the translation, will look at the Spanish and translate it back into English, and then they will confirm accuracy. Another thing that we encourage you to do, particularly if it's related to your content and the materials, is create a community or peer review panel. A lot of times, the translation companies, they have translators that translate in specific languages. So if it's a very academic kind of translation company, it's going to be Spanish from Spain, right? The academic Spanish, and not necessarily what is needed or what works for the community, the grantees that you are providing the technical assistance training to. So having them review materials is a great way to confirm accuracy of the translation. And if you are going to have a review panel, once again, highlighting the importance of recognizing that skill and contribution and setting aside money to compensate the review panel. So really quick, mechanized translation, Google Translate. I'm sure you've all encountered it in some way or another. And so when I talk about Google Translate, I'm also talking about the Google Translate earbuds, any kind of mechanized form of interpretation. You know, you've seen the apps where somebody like, hey, Canon's going to Italy and he wants to find how to get directions to the Colosseum. And then I talk into my phone and it spits out Italian. And then the Italian person gives me directions and it spits out the directions in English to me. So there is a limitation. And so I used to work for an agency and we were putting in parking machines. And we had to translate the information on the parking machine. And they came to me and they said, hey, can we translate this? And I said, okay, great. Tell me what's our budget and how much time do they have? And they told me, we don't have a budget and we need it in 2 days. And so we said, oh, well, okay, that's not good. So we distilled it down. So it was about 3 sentences, and we distilled all that language down into exact change only. So if you're here, you understand when I say exact change only, if it's $5 for parking and I put $10 bill in, I know I'm not going to get any change back. And so we tried Google Translate. And the Spanish worked, the Vietnamese worked, and what we got back, I believe in simplified Chinese, instead of exact change only, we got exact transformation only. And so why I use this example is, Google Translate, mechanized translation technology is so much better than it was, but what it doesn't get is context. It is a learning software, right? And so it has to be used multiple times in order to understand the context. So when you're thinking about using something like Google Translate or mechanized translation, just consider what you're trying to translate, right? And what's at stake, like how important is it? And understand the limitations of the technology. The other thing I want to highlight about these forms of technology is they are learning software, right? So they are recording everything that you're putting in there. And that means that the information that you've used, that you've used the technology to translate, is now sitting in a database somewhere. And so when you're kind of doing a calculation on whether or not to use something like Google Translate, or you're trying to communicate to organizations, grantees that you're working with, and they say, yeah, we use Google Translate, and that, to communicate with the client, right, or communicate with the survivor. Just know that when you put it into Google Translate, it's being stored somewhere and somebody has access to that information, right? So it is a security risk, and I just want to flag that for everybody. So really quick, I just wanted to show Zoom. We like Zoom because the interpretation features are they're integrated into the platform. So if we had interpretation activated on for this here, webinar, this training, you would see an interpretation button at the bottom. And so in order to do that, you have to go into your settings, and then you can turn on language interpretation. That's a feature at the bottom. You have to have, I believe, the business level account in Zoom in order to have language access or language interpretation as part of the platform. And so there are about 9 channels at once that you can have, and you can assign languages to those channels. And so what happens is a pull-up menu shows up, and then you just add the languages, and your interpreters are actually assigned to those channels. So they actually don't call into the main Zoom line. They're given a separate line, and they actually don't have access to the main Zoom, right? And so for interpretation, what you would do is you would type in the email address, and then it would send the link for that interpretation channel. So frequently when we work with Zoom interpreters is they actually have 2 computers. One computer is set up to be in the main Zoom room, and one computer is set up for the interpreted line. And so this is just a real quick overview of what Zoom looks like. Once again, we're here as a resource for you. If it's a lot of information we've gone over, and maybe a lot of things that you hadn't thought about or considered. So please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or you need any help.
Thanks, Cannon. I don't see any questions in the chat right now. So I just want to thank everyone for coming to the TA Initiative training and orientation. This is our last session for the orientation. I'm putting in the chat where the recordings and materials for all of the sessions can be found. We'll have this one up by the end of today up on the website. As Neela mentioned at the beginning of this session, if you're new staff or a new TA organization, there is a webinar completion checklist on the website that you can download, complete, and email to the OVW Tech Assistance mailbox. The due date is February 14th, but as Neela mentioned, if you need to outreach to her about that, the email address is on the form. So thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Cannon. This is wonderful information. I learn something new every time. Thank you to everyone who attended today, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.